Hi, I'm Kieren.
And I'm Riku.
Welcome to Artificially Ever After. For today's episode,
Will AI let us talk to animals?
Hi everyone.
Welcome back. So, we got a fun topic today. Been looking forward to this one.
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting application of AI that's maybe not one that's been that widely covered in the media and stuff. Maybe it's nothing super important necessarily. We're going to cover the reasons that we have this application of AI. It's nothing that's going to, I don't think, drastically change how we go about our lives daily, as some of the other applications of AI are definitely doing. But it's still really interesting. And I think if we sort of crack this application, then maybe it will change how we live our lives. We're gonna cover all the reasons that people are looking to try and use AI to talk to animals, aren't we?
Yeah, it's probably one of those ideas that people romanticize, and maybe it's not a money grabber. Maybe that's why people aren't talking about it as much, because the big companies are probably doing other things that make more money. But
exactly, that's
I think this is definitely a very big spiritual motivation for this kind of tech. So, what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, well, we're going to go back because one thing I was just going to quickly say is that while it might only be a recent idea, because as we'll see, technology is starting to allow it, that we could possibly kind of communicate and understand animal language. Humans have been fascinated with animals for a long time, and studying their behavior and how they communicate with each other. So we're going to firstly look back, aren't we? So we're going to, as we always do, go back into the history, but maybe a little bit more general in how humans have been studying animal language and when that started. And then when we started to see kind of computers and only very recently, actually, AI come onto the scene for doing that. Then we're going to cover some of the ways in which it's a very difficult task and why it's hard for humans to understand animals and why computers might be able to kind of alleviate some of those problems. And then specifically how AI is being used to help and some of the current really cool projects that are being done to try and understand animal communication. And yeah, we're going to do a little bit of demystifying, aren't we, as well in there. So discuss, it's quite an interesting way that AI can actually translate. And this goes for human languages too. So we're going to talk about the general way in which AI can translate between languages. And people are trying to generalize that even further in the hope that maybe it can also translate between animals and humans or kind of species, I guess. Then fun fact break. Have you got your fun fact?
I've got my fun fact.
I found mine out this morning.
Nice.
But I think it's quite a good one. I'm excited for my fun fact.
I love a last minute fun fact.
They're sometimes the best.
Yeah. So after our fun facts, we're going to go through the ethical side of being able to speak and converse with animals. I think there's loads of ways actually this technology can go. There's some amazing opportunities and obviously some risks. So look forward to that part of the episode.
Yeah, it's also, I think, not that many people, at least from what I could see in literature, have kind of discussed what it would be like to live in a world where we just communicate with animals as if you and I were just communicating with each other. So I've only started to think about that since we've done this episode research. And it is a weird concept to think what that would be like. And I guess what we're going to try and discuss is how, I guess, humans would behave differently and what we would do with that kind of power. Hopefully, I guess as we do with a lot of other things, we can sometimes abuse that power. So that's all that we're going to be discussing. You know, if we were at that very extreme scenario where we could just easily talk to any animal that we wanted to. So yeah, should we get into it?
Let's do it.
So the first thing we wanted to quickly do is just, I'm sure a lot of you listening probably already know this, but there are actually loads of different ways that animals do communicate with each other. So we just wanted to cover a few of those very extreme examples of animal communication to give a bit of intuition as to why this is a very hard problem.
Exactly. There's so many different modalities of communication. I think that we generally just think of communicating through sound, but even within sound, humans actually have a pretty poor coverage of that space. So we can only hear between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. So there are animals like bats and dolphins that can communicate in the ultrasound. So they're still communicating through sound, but we have no idea. They're communicating at such a high pitch. You know those singers that can sing, if they sing high enough in pitch, they break the glass. But they're going way beyond that because we can still hear them singing. So that's kind of scary. There's this whole conversation going on and you can't even hear it.
And then you've got infrasound as well, don't you? So then going even lower than what we can hear. So you've obviously got very, very low bassy voices, but then beyond that kind of goes to these, maybe that's kind of if you've been to a festival or something and the bass is so low that you feel it rather than hear those certain frequencies. So that's kind of what infrasound is getting at, isn't it? And I think a lot of elephants communicate down at that lower end of the spectrum, I guess maybe because they're much bigger animals, they can generate those lower frequencies.
There's whales as well.
Whales as well, yeah. They can be heard for much further away, can't they?
Yeah, I heard it's 260 decibels, which is literally the loudness of a jet plane.
That's crazy. Yeah, is an ambulance like 100 or something like that? Maybe?
Yeah, and it's logarithmic. So
Oh yeah, of course it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like thousands times.
So that means
louder.
with the logarithmic scale, so each decibel you go up is a tenfold. So that's 10 times the previous one, isn't it? So 200 decibels is just absolutely wild. Yeah. But we can't hear that with our human ears, can we?
Exactly. So even just in audio, we're completely, we're only hearing a tiny fraction of the sounds that animals are making. But there's other ones, like ants, they communicate through pheromones. So they just release chemicals, there's someone's dropped some nice bit of donut over here. Let's walk this way.
Yeah.
Bees do a lot of visual communication. So they do this famous honeybee dance, which communicates where the nectar is and stuff like that. Yeah,
and obviously even for humans as well, so much of communication is what you see and not necessarily what you hear. I guess even facial expressions, just in terms of human to human communication. And then you kind of get into the whole spectrum of all the different things that animals can see as well. So I know there are certain migrating birds and they can actually see the electromagnetic fields of the earth. And they use that to kind of navigate over long distances, which is wild. But today we are going to be mainly focusing on verbal and sound communication, aren't we? Yeah,
we'll focus just on audio because it's the main way humans communicate. And since we're talking about communicating with animals, it makes sense that it's probably easier to do if we learn to translate our human words into animal audio.
And as you'll see a little bit later on, when we start to discuss how we're actually using AI to do that, we're using these large language models. So they are learning to manipulate human language. So we kind of want a way to map to human language, and the natural way at least, or the easier way maybe, or more intuitive way, is to do that from sounds rather than all the different visible forms of communication.
I think it could be harsh to force people to learn the bee dance to communicate with bees.
Yeah, that is true. Just one other one to mention, which I thought was quite cool, which is producing a sound. So this is probably one we should include in there as well, is a form of communication that a lot of animals do called stridulation. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's where they make sounds, not just with their kind of vocal cords and mouths, but they rub parts of their bodies together. So crickets is a good example of that, like the cricket noises you hear is stridulation.
When you make a bad joke.
Yes.
Sorry.
Got the cricket sound. And I think, interestingly, a lot of researchers that have been studying animal communication have only found some of this out about the kind of range of communication of different animals more recently when they've started using computers and digital audio recordings, which kind of makes sense because it's not as if we could hear that elephants communicate in lower frequencies or we could hear that bats communicate in higher frequencies, because if we just tried to listen to them, we'd never know that, would we? Because we physically can't hear them. So there's been some researchers that only when they've started to use computers and microphones, which can record in a much wider spectrum, and then they visualize the spectrograms, which are like a heat map of the sound. They can only then start to see that the sound and the communication is going outside of the human hearing range. So that is often how we actually can, as humans, kind of quote unquote hear the animals speaking, is by visualizing these heat maps of their kind of of their spectrograms.
Oh wow! I guess that tees us really nice into why this conversation's entered the AI space, is because, as you mentioned, the human bandwidth of the frequencies they can listen to is so finite that it just makes sense to move to technology to fill that gap.
Exactly, yeah. It's kind of like when we did our self-driving car episode with Teslas. It makes a lot of sense that they could theoretically be better drivers than humans because they can have so many different sensory inputs and can understand a lot more and detect a lot more about the physical world than we can just through our eyes and ears. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that computers that computers could do a better job than us.
Yeah. So why are we having this conversation? Like, why do you think people are so interested in it?
Yeah, well, I was digging around on that, and other than the fact that it's just pretty cool, there are some reasons, and I guess this ties into what I was saying earlier, that we've wanted to study animals, and humans have been curious about animal behavior and communication for some time. So part of it is just around scientific curiosity, that we are, curious, inquisitive beings as humans, and we do just want to understand more about the world. And I guess animal communication is an area of the physical world that we live in that we still don't understand at all. We just can't understand that. So there's the kind of scientific curiosity part. I think then also another thing that it does is partly break down what's known as the human-animal divide. So I guess partly because we've evolved to be far more intelligent than some species. We've, as humans throughout history, very much seen ourselves as a species as being very distinct from other species and other animals. And that has led us to observe them and understand their behavior with a very strong bias. So I think a good example, which we've mentioned previously, is we never used to think that animals or certain animals had kind of emotions or feelings. So part of it, if we can understand how they talk more and the types of things that they would maybe say to each other, the emotions that they would express, maybe that would help us to get closer to animals and not see them as something very distinct from humans, but we're just kind of another animal, which we are. So breaking down that human-animal divide is definitely a motivation as well.
Yeah, and I think touched on it earlier about kind of like a spiritual motivation for us is that humans are quite unique in the sense that like we feel distinctly more conscious than other animals, and people looking for aliens and stuff. And my old supervisor was saying, like, why look in the stars when there's literally a load of aliens on our planet, and we need to like understand them better. And
that's a good point.
I think it's true because right now, like, the only people that we can turn to for existential problems and things are other humans. And having another animal's perspective on life, I think, would actually be completely mind-blowing. I mean, I think people are quite motivated to pursue this technology because it would be very reassuring to kind of hear like a dog's perspective of life. Maybe there are things you can share, and
I feel like they have a very happy perspective on life.
Yeah,
the lives they lead.
Yeah.
And I guess also, like, given what we were just saying about the sensory input of certain animals, you could understand that their perspective, maybe a bat is a good example, would be so drastically different in their perception of the world. So perhaps they have kind of concluded things about the world and the universe that we as humans, with the way that we perceive it, could never imagine to do. So yeah, I don't think we could quite conceive what it would be like to really connect on a personal level with animals, just because we've been so distant to them. And
I think, like, before we sound like we're like assuming that animals have this like higher knowledge, I think that from our perspective of our intelligence, I think we would create meaning through the insights that an animal have. They almost certainly have a much more simple way of thinking. But maybe that's what we need.
And I think also an interesting one, which is another motivation to understand them, is this idea of like conservation efforts. And I think partly why we often find it very hard to put ourselves in the mind of other animals is because we as humans are now kind of so detracted from those environments that they live in. We've urbanized, we've built all this technology that has really removed us from where we came from as humans. So maybe, unless we go out and live in the desert or, like a rainforest for months on end, which I'm sure some of these researchers have done that have been trying to understand language, perhaps the only way that we can get back to our roots in that way and maybe kind of reconnect with nature and then hopefully help these conservation efforts is if we can translate between humans and animals. So we're going to discuss in the second half, aren't we, like some of the goals and hopefully some of the future directions for what this technology could enable. But we just wanted to touch on why humans have been interested in understanding animals so far in history. So on that note, should we look back and just quickly cover a very brief history of humans trying to understand animals a bit better?
Yeah, and I had a thought actually, literally this morning, and I was like, the first account of human to animal communication was probably in the Bible.
Okay.
When the serpent spoke to Eve in the book of Genesis.
There you go.
I think that from a very historical point of view, the concept of language and communicating through tongues is really deeply rooted in our culture, given the historical significance of the Bible. So, albeit maybe not a real account, however you interpret it. I think that's really interesting that it came up so early on in one of the oldest books that we reference.
And I think human intelligence as well, which kind of hints to that, has allowed us, I think it's called theory of mind, where you're able to put your kind of mind in the body of something else. Granted, we were just saying that that's a problem that humans have with animals, but we've been able to imagine that animals communicate to each other. Like we don't have any kind of hardcore facts that they do because we can't understand it. But we kind of imagine that when we hear animals making noises to each other, they're communicating. So we kind of guess that they have a language, don't we?
Yeah.
But in terms of studying, in a very kind of rigorous scientific way, with animal behavior, I think more broadly it started with their overall behavior. I guess was Charles Darwin, from what I was looking at in the 1800s. So he was studying the kind of emotional expression of animals, and he was looking to do that to try and better understand evolution and their evolutionary roots of that behavior, and then relate it back to humans, and hopefully that would kind of give some insight into human evolution and where our language came from. And I think it was in one of his most famously published books, which was called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, and that was published in 1872. So long time ago that, there was some scientific research being done around kind of animal behavior and communication. And if that was the very early seed, you can imagine that, it wasn't at all going to the level of trying to understand the words that animals were saying or the actual points that they were trying to get across to each other. It's just very general, coarse-grained behavioral traits.
Yeah. Moving to 1960s, this was where the early works of dolphin vocalization studies by John Lilly. And this is when they first discovered that they use complex clicks and whistles in certain patterns that form some basis of communication.
Yeah. So I've always found that a really interesting example, because like the clicks that you hear dolphins make is a good example of something that's so far removed from human language. It's interesting that we'd hear that and think, oh, that's them communicating with each other. But and then in the 1970s, there was a very famous American philosopher called Thomas Nagel, and he published a renowned paper that was titled "What is it like to be a bat?" And he basically concluded in that our attempt to comprehend animal experience was doomed to fail. But he was specifically saying that was doomed to fail because we were trying to understand it through the lens of a human and through our kind of sensory input. And he discussed this notion, which we're going to refer back to throughout this episode, of something called the Umwelt, which is basically the world view or kind of understanding of reality of a different animal or being. And we as humans obviously have our very specific worldview through our senses, through our evolution. And it's very, very difficult to put yourselves in the umwelt of a different animal. But people have kind of discussed since what he concluded of it being a futile attempt that computers could be a way, as we were discussing, that could let us kind of go between the worldviews.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess that touches on like anthropomorph.
Yeah.
Can you say it?
Oh god, I can't even say it. Anthropomorphizing. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Projecting the human view and experience onto other animals.
Yeah. One man's experience is another man's doorstop.
There you go. And then you've got these kind of classic examples where it's going the other way, where we've actually taught animals to try and communicate in human ways. So you've got Coco the gorilla, who was from the 1970s through to the 2010s, I think, when he passed away. And Coco was taught American Sign Language and learned over 1,000 different signs and demonstrated kind of like deep emotional understanding using these different signs. And then there was a parrot called Alex. It was an African grey parrot and learnt to use over 100 words to identify different objects and colours.
Wow.
And even engage in problem solving. So we've tried to go both ways with this, haven't we? That, obviously when we've struggled to understand the subtle clicks of dolphins, we thought, right, we'll try and teach animals English instead.
Yeah.
And it's kind of worked, which I don't know what that says about humans and their intelligence, but...
maybe it means the other way around.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, so how do we use AI to learn how to speak to animals? So before we go into that, we're going to start with actually how do we actually use AI to translate between human to human languages? Mm-hmm. Because I think like once we start with that, we can then understand the more abstract one of humans and animals.
Yeah, and an interesting point, which will also help us to understand how AI is now working. Using AI and training it for this exact task of translating between human languages was where the initial inspiration kind of technology came for large language models that now power chatbots like ChatGPT, didn't it?
Yeah.
So it's this idea of machine translation, so AI-powered translation. But yeah, so to explain it firstly, so from human to human languages, we have to take kind of a new approach to translation. So if you think back to if you've learned a language in school, I think I learned Spanish and German. I might have even done a bit of French at school. Did you? What did you do? I think that was a standard 3 in England.
I
wasn't
wish
it?
I had Spanish. I just did German.
German. Oh, okay. Not that I remember any of them now. I've got a little bit of Spanish left in there somewhere. But we are taught. So if you remember back in school, you're taught vocabulary. So you're obviously taught to kind of match, one word to another. But another big part of learning languages in school is the grammar. So what you're doing there is learning the kind of specific laws and sentence structures for each language, because it's very different depending kind of where in the world you are. So, the way that you form sentences in English is very different to how you form sentences in Japanese. You obviously know that a lot better than I do. But what we have is this kind of these laws and these rules. It's rules about the kind of patterns and where the different words go in the sentences that are unique to different languages. So in school, you're taught in a very kind of manual way, you're taught those new rules for a unique language. But, we could never do that for whales, for example. So we couldn't kind of go in a whale's habitat and live there for months on end to understand their kind of rule structure and then teach it to a human. So we need a new approach, and we need this way that AI can kind of do it on its own. And this is this new paradigm of deep learning that can use a lot of data, and it can learn a lot of these rules on its own. So what we've seen with large language models and this kind of machine translation is that if you give a large enough AI enough language data, it can over time start to kind of infer and learn some of these rules on its own. So you don't need a human to teach it. And it can do that for whichever language it kind of has enough data for. So yeah, this is this ability of very large, now also kind of generative AI like ChatGPT. This is this ability to learn these very complex patterns within language that we want to tap into. So we've already started to use that for human-to-human translation, and it's working a lot better than what we had previously, so the previous kind of computer algorithms. And people are now trying to find these creative ways that we might be able to do that for animals as well, because of the fact that it's unsupervised. So you don't need a human expert that understands whale language really well. It can just learn it on its own.
Yeah, so the way this looks with human language is, I think ChatGPT has been around long enough that people understand that it's predicting the next word and things, and because there's already the next word in the data set, you don't need a human to say, oh, for this sentence this is the next word. It's already there.
Yeah.
And well, it works for English. You can do it for any language. So that means that you can have an English AI model, Japanese AI model.
Yeah.
The Japanese one will be doing the exact same thing, a load of Japanese text and predict the next word. So what's actually going on in these models? What are they actually learning? You had a nice analogy to go with, right?
Yeah, well, I think we've mentioned this idea of embedding spaces before, so we don't want to go too technical with any of this, because as with all of these AI topics, if you go too far, it goes so abstract and you can't understand it. But a nice way to think of these embedding spaces with language is that if you kind of think that the language of English that we're obviously speaking now is a big galaxy where every star in that galaxy is a word, then words that are similar in their meanings are close together in that kind of physical galaxy, in that space. And this is what we refer to as this kind of embedding space. And it's a very, very big space that humans kind of can't really understand on their own. But one thing that we have started to learn about these embedding spaces is a really cool, interesting feature that direction and distance has very important meanings in these embedding spaces. So one really intuitive example is that the word king is the same distance and direction in this kind of galaxy from man as queen is from woman. So, if we kind of go the same distance and direction from the planet king to man, if you do exactly that same route from queen, you'll end up at woman. And what we've started to see, a really cool feature of this, is that those kind of distances and spaces, when you go to a large enough scale, so a kind of big enough galaxy, they're actually the same for different languages. And these directions are the same sort of thing. So hombre and mujer, I guess, if you go into Spanish, those are probably the two words I still remember, might be the same direction and distance away from each other. So the way that we translate between them is we try and match up these galaxies. And then if we know where kind of one word in English is, if we kind of go, I'm thinking in my mind now of like some sort of multiverse, like kind of Spider-Man analogy, where we kind of go to the other galaxy from a different language, we'll end up at that same word but in Spanish. And that's how we can use AI, these very big language models, to do this kind of complex translation.
Yes. So the core idea here is that on a relational level, different languages actually understand the world in the same way.
Yeah.
And the only difference is maybe the orientation, or but that doesn't really matter, because then the new problem is, well, you have your English galaxy and then you have your Japanese galaxy, and well, because we think that king and queen are the same relationship in both languages, the problem is, okay, well, how do you just align? If you just align these things, then if I pick out the star of king, it would just be on top of that for king in Japanese.
Yeah.
Which is or.
Nice.
And then you have your translation task done.
And the great thing about this, which is what we were touching on as the motivation for using this large language model approach, is that if you have large enough data sets for different languages, you don't need definitions or understandings of particular words in order to translate and navigate between them. What you only need to do is for a few kind of words, or we kind of call them anchor points, you just need to know, let's say, king in Spanish and English, or a few others, in order to align those galaxies. But then once you've done that for a few words that you do know, you can jump between them for any word without the definition.
So to bring this back to the human-animal conversation, so we do the same. We do the same thing. So we first need to create a galaxy for the animal. So you have your whale galaxy, your cat galaxy, and ideally we find these anchor points to just align their languages with ours.
Yeah.
Now, the first thing we're probably thinking as well, how rich is their galaxy? Are they capable of creating one as rich as ours?
Yeah.
And
what's the word for king in dolphin clicks?
Exactly. They probably don't have that word, or maybe they do. So
maybe that was a good one, actually, like the kind of king of a pack. There might be something that's similar notion of the kind of top person.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Yeah.
Top dolphin. Sorry.
Yeah. Like the alpha hierarchy kind of situation.
Yeah.
But conceptually, we don't actually need to necessarily do this anchor point. Finding the exact same word in the two galaxies and aligning them thing. We can actually align based on sentiment. So if certain sounds are associated with happiness of a dolphin, those of you with dogs and things kind of know when your dog's crying versus when it's happy.
Yeah.
If you can extract those audio files and align them with, how happy or sad they are, you can do the same thing and just align that happy sad galaxy axis with your human galaxy.
At least that's the idea, isn't it? So that's hopefully what we're going to be able to do.
Just do it. It's easy.
So that's what the researchers are assuming we can do. I guess we should emphasize that no one's actually been able to do that yet. And we're going to come on to kind of examples of using AI in this way. But that's how we're hoping to be able to translate in this way is based on these sentiments or feelings that, we'd have a cluster of stars in that galaxy that are happy, and then maybe somewhere else in that galaxy, like Riku was saying, is the sad area of the galaxy. But I think that takes us nicely just quickly discussing the current challenges in using AI and why we're not quite there yet, and what we would need in order to get to this point where we can translate in a similar way that we do for human languages. And one is this lack of kind of really rich, good data. So firstly, these large language models that we've had to train ChatGPT, they're trained on, billions of words and examples of text, human language. So the order of magnitude in terms of the data that we have on certain animals is, it's incomparable, isn't it? It's such a small fraction that we'd have on dolphin or cat language and communication. So we need to scale up the data collection. But not only do we just need the kind of audio recordings of these animals communicating, if we want to align them with kind of human language in the same way, we need some information as well about the kind of context in which those animals are using that communication. Since we can't just have an expert whale or cat that can speak English, we need to observe them in their environment and see what actions they're doing, see which emotions they might be exhibiting at the same time that they're saying those specific words or making those sounds. So that is how we're going to be able to ground them, isn't it, in that kind of galaxy?
Exactly, because on our last point about this alignment, we because we know that it'll be very hard to find the same word in both galaxies, we need something else, which is a sentiment, which is the context, as you're saying here.
Yeah.
Another really, really big problem is you're not the only one in the ocean. So they call it the cocktail party problem. So the reason for that is, imagine you're at a cocktail party, there's loads of people having loads of different conversations. If you're recording the audio, if you just put a microphone in the corner of the room, can you hone in on one person's conversation? There's so much audio going on, it probably just sounds like a jumbled mess.
Yeah.
And the problem of extracting, let's say the president was speaking to someone and loads of people in the room, can you just completely cancel out everyone else's voice other than the president?
Exactly,
that
that's
is the
also,
problem.
you're touching on the potential misuses of that technology, aren't you, which I think you're going to mention later. But I think, the reason this is really important is because often, or at least the data that we have already on certain animals, I think elephants is a good example. We have kind of microphones which are put in their environments and their habitats, and they record lots and lots of sound over a long period of time. But in that period, we have loads of different elephants that are making those sounds. And, since we can't speak elephant, it's a lot harder for us to kind of go in and pick out one sound from another. So that is a problem, but it's also an area that AI is actually helping, isn't it? So AI can, in, again, this kind of unsupervised way, by understanding and being trained on humans making different sounds, it is able to try to separate from one single audio file the different elephants that are kind of making sounds. So, if we start to address some of these problems, which what we're going to come on to discuss now are some of the cool research groups that are looking to do this, if we can get more data, if we can match that with some visual information about the context in this kind of umwelt, then maybe we can start to get to this utopia of having this way to translate between. But there are some cool projects that are already making really, really significant progress in this area, aren't there?
Yeah, and bird songs are one of the earliest applications of AI to understand their patterns, their calls and what they're singing about.
Yeah, maybe that's a slightly easier one because obviously it's... I guess they're air-based animals, but they're not in the sea, so maybe it's easier for us to put microphones in their habitat. But another good example, which is going into the sea, is an organization called Project SETI. So it's a non-profit, and the SETI part stands for, if I say this right again, it's Cetacean Translation Initiative, which is basically translating whale sounds. So they're trying to gather this very large amount of data using microphones in the ocean, and I think also possibly attaching microphones to whales as well, I believe, or that might be a different research team, but trying to get this continuous gathering of whale sounds and attaching those with videos as well sometimes of what they're doing at the time to try and decode sperm whale communication. So that's another big one.
I think people have been speaking about dolphins being able to converse with each other a lot. You see it in a lot of like TV and things, and it's really interesting how, because as you say, why aren't we doing this research for air-based communicating animals? But I think what's really cool is that it's these whales and dolphins that are the ones that actually seem to have the intelligence capable of having language. So
that's true, yeah.
It's not like we chose to go into this difficult ocean to figure out animal language. It's that we've observed that they have the most language, and annoyingly we have to go into the ocean to do that research.
That's true, yeah. And as we'll see in the second half as well, there are some interesting applications for conservation efforts, specifically around marine life and kind of boat and ship usage. So very interesting. I think the Earth Species Project is another big one that's looking to decode and understand dolphin communication specifically. So lots of different initiatives, and they're aware of all of these challenges with using AI. And I think one of the central themes with what they're all currently doing, the stage that they're at, is the kind of data collection phase. So they're trying to generate these big data sets of animal sounds. Cool.
Wow.
So time for our fun fact break. So we'll take a little pause and then we'll come back and in the second half talk about ethical considerations of all of this. What does it mean if we can talk to animals or understand them, firstly? And then, a little bit about the future.
Cool.
Okie dokie. Fun fact.
Yeah. What's yours?
Yeah, you went first last time, didn't you? So mine is just a quick one, which is that the word robot was first introduced in a play from the 1920s, and it comes from the Czech word robota, which means forced labour. And it actually hints to the theme of this play and what the kind of robots were doing. And the play is basically about humanoid machines, which the reason I talked about this one now is these kind of Tesla humanoids that you might have seen. I think they're called the Optimuses or something.
Oh, yeah.
And in this play, they were built to perform these menial tasks for humans before eventually rebelling against humans. So that's where the word robot actually comes from.
That's really interesting. Wow. Well, my fun fact is I was trying to think about how we can all relate to AI. Okay. So it's a bit boring, but anyway, I believe almost everyone that studied something like physics or biology at like college level or something.
It's quite high. That's not very many.
Or like in sixth form, or in secondary school.
Yeah, school level.
Yeah, in secondary school, has done AI. So I was thinking that when you're in like biology class and you're like making measurements, and do you ever remember maybe measuring I don't know, the width of a leaf versus its length, and then you like draw like a little like X's on a graph.
Okay.
And then you get your ruler out and then you draw a line of best fit.
Yeah.
That is you doing AI. Because what you're doing is called linear regression. So you're using data, your recordings, to predict the relationship between two things.
Yeah.
So then, like, if you were to get like a leaf of a width you've never seen before, you can predict its length.
Yeah. I guess that makes that sheet of paper that you've done that on a little bit of artificial intelligence then, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think that hopefully that makes it less scary because, you know, that's all it takes to do AI.
Nice. Cool. That was very different vibes from each of us there.
Yeah.
Cool, back to the episode. Okay, welcome back to the episode. So, now we're going to quickly look forward and try to understand what the future might look like and some of the ethical considerations. And to do that, I'm going to put the question to you, Riku, to help us understand what would it mean if we could talk to animals or at least understand them.
I think the first thing that will happen is a big rise in the animal rights movement, because the minute we can start conversing with animals, I think it will just validate that they are, you know, more conscious beings than at least we think now. That in the current form, where we don't really think that they have a very sophisticated understanding of the world, we would then be able to actually, to the best of, you know, our ability, understand how they see the world. And you know, something like conservationists can ask endangered species about their environments, and we'd actually be able to hopefully figure out a solution that will protect and, you know, maybe regrow a lot of species around the world. Yeah,
and I guess this is a big motivation for the research and where the funding is coming from, are these kind of conservation efforts, aren't they? That, you know, what better way to understand how you're affecting an animal or a species if you can just hear it from them. From the horse's mouth, as they say.
Nice.
Sorry to pardon the pun. So that's definitely one big application, isn't it? I guess another one, which, you know, this one's slightly benefiting humans more than the animals again, is to communicate and understand livestock. So we know we'd better understand, farmers would better understand how to care for their livestock and how to look after them if they had problems or were getting ill. One really interesting fact that I didn't know, you know, going back to how certain animals communicate, plants actually make sounds as well. So plants in distress make ultrasonic clicking noises. And certain plants, I think the tomato plant was one that I came across, that when they're too dry, they have very specific clicking sounds that can be different from like wheat plants. So, you know, you can imagine like if a farmer could listen to his field of plants and understand or hear which ones are diseased, I guess then pesticides, you'd only use them in a very small proportion of the crop. So that's a really interesting application. And then that scales as well, I guess, to mammals that are kept as livestock. And then on that note as well, maybe going back to helping the animals rather than helping humans there, another application and motivation is for vets. So, hinting at like a Dr. Dolittle type situation there, if any of you seen the movie, where you could just kind of listen and have a consultation with your dog or some kind of pet and hear what's wrong with it rather than just kind of having to figure out on your own. So these are the kind of motivating factors for this research, and I think they help us to frame, when we know what they're potentially going to be used for, it helps us to frame some of the ethical questions, doesn't it?
Yeah. That being said, the one of the first ethical problems or challenges is that it's really difficult to validate our AI translator or the AI interpreter. So we can't kind of just say, "Oh, excuse me, Mr. Sperm Whale, is that really what you meant?"
Yeah.
We're very much just kind of doing this pattern matching.
Yes.
And we're just gonna use it. And another big kind of concept that we've kind of stepped around in this episode is that how complex a language can each individual animal be able to comprehend? Because maybe Mr. Sperm Whale we could have a back and forth and have that conversation, but with maybe little Ant-Man, the ant probably, almost certainly can't handle that level of conceptual understanding. So that's something we've kind of waddled around here.
Yeah, it's probably, because human language is so complex and rich, it's probably quite easy to do that mapping from a simpler language to human language, like you were saying. But it's probably a much more difficult task to kind of distill very complex human thoughts and concepts down into a language which has fewer words and maybe therefore less richness. So, maybe to start with, which I think is what most of the research efforts are doing to begin with, maybe it's a lot easier to try and translate what different animals are saying into some human words. But trying to go the other way is probably a lot more difficult. But there definitely are research groups which are generating synthetic sounds of animals, and they are able to use generative AI to kind of match patterns from bird sounds is one that I'd come across, to play kind of similar patterns of sounds before we actually understand exactly what they mean, which again, this also raises some of the ethical considerations there. So this one that I'd come across was a chiffchaff, which is a bird, and there was enough data to train a generative model. So just to play them side by side, this was a real chiffchaff call. And then this was the synthesized version, which the AI generated to kind of match the patterns. So, you probably couldn't tell a difference, which I guess is the point, but the sound is extremely similar, but so the AI can generate a very realistic sounding bird call without us fully understanding, what it means there.
That was really cool. I feel like the bird's name, there's words that are named after like the sound they make.
That's a good one.
Yeah, sounds like but that goes straight into the next point of conversation, which is referring to playback experiments. And one example of this is for poachers. So imagine someone has this chiffchaff sound generator and it was producing a mating call. A poacher can just quite easily play that, brings a male or female bird, and boom, down goes the bird. Yeah. And that can obviously be for very, endangered. So I probably shouldn't have said down goes the bird.
I didn't even clock that's what you said. That's funny.
And poachers generally do this for endangered species because they're going to be most expensive. So this kind of dual use of this technology can go a really bad way.
Yeah, and that's obviously why they're endangered as well, isn't it? That's definitely a horrible misuse of that technology. I even saw there was one anecdote from some researchers that are trying to understand whale communication. They did a playback experiment, not for any kind of poaching or hunting reasons, but they played a whale's name back to itself, and the whale basically became very distressed. So it's a great power to yield, and I don't think we've thought anywhere near long or hard enough about what it means to wield that power or how we could use it. But hopefully, if we put restrictions on the use of the technology, it can be used for good and conservation efforts. But it is a very big power if we can manipulate animals in that way without them being able to understand us as well.
Yeah, and maybe an extra example, which is a bit of a side kind of ethical consideration, is that to generate the data for these models, you'll have to solve this cocktail party problem. And as we mentioned, the minute that technology gets developed and there's one microphone in any public place, that's the end of human privacy. So
yeah, that's a very good espionage tool. I'd like to think, though, that, I mean, I've seen other research papers where people are specifically doing that for human communication, trying to solve the cocktail party problem. So I do think whilst it's going on in animal communication research, it would probably happen anyway, and I'm sure like governments and espionage agencies are trying to develop it, or probably have it already anyway.
But that aside, it is a really exciting area of technology, and with all things there's like positive and negatives, and I think we want to end the episode on a positive note. So with a final thought, if we could talk to animals, how would it change our world? And I don't know, Kieren, have you got any hopes for this technology?
Yeah, I mean, we'd love for you, the listener, to kind of think about that on your own. Obviously, we can't hear your thoughts now, but that's a good time for me to say that we'd love your feedback, and if you could reach out to contact us. But if I was to think about that, I'd like to think back to what we were saying at the start, that it would, despite all of the negative uses, I think the only thing that it could do in the near term is bring us closer to animals, because we're already so far away from them in our environment. It'd be hard to get any further away from understanding certain species. So I do think the only direction that this could hopefully take us is getting closer to animals. And hopefully, if we're closer to animals, then we'd have much more respect for their environments, and that also, I guess, means the kind of natural environment that we're very far away from now, and maybe that would help us understand and prioritize some of the big problems that we have today. So I'd like to think it's a very cool application of AI, but maybe it could also help us solve some pretty big problems and help preserve and look after the huge plethora of species and different animals that we often see as extremely different to humans, that we don't pay as much attention to.
Wow, that was really nice. That was a really nice answer.
That's my hope.
I feel like I've got maybe a lower level take, but I think personally I'm quite I think a lot about existential things, and I worry that there's an element of don't meet your heroes, and if I could speak to my dog, I might be inspired by the simplicity of its thoughts and be motivated to not worry about things in the same way, or I could be incredibly disappointed because all it takes to be happy is just to think about food. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe anthropomorphization makes us respect certain animals more than, or think they're more intelligent than they actually are. I really hope that's not the case. I don't think it is.
And I imagine you're stroking your dog and it's talking to you while you're doing that. I think that could be...
Get off. Yeah. Please leave me alone.
But yeah, it's a really cool idea.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this because this is actually a fairly newer application of a lot of the AI concepts that we've touched on previously. So hopefully things will be progressing quite quickly and we'll see some really cool changes and breakthroughs. And yeah, we'll definitely return to this, but big things to come. Yeah, we had a nice lighthearted episode this time, but moving on to our next episode, are we running out of data to train our AIs? Yeah, so we've seen loads of news articles about these big breakthroughs and rapid progress in some of the kind of chatbots and generative AIs that we interact with, or we might interact with now on a daily or weekly basis. They've been changing really quickly, but there is some fundamental limitation with how we're building these models and training them, and we're kind of reaching some threshold for how much data we actually have for them. So, we're going to talk about all the different aspects of what that means. Is AI progress slowing down? Is it speeding up? But yeah, stay tuned for our next episode where we're hopefully going to get into all of that. And in the meantime, we'd love your feedback and any episode suggestions as well. We've covered a few listener recommendations so far, but please leave in the comments on Spotify or email us at contact@artificiallyeverafter.com if you have any suggestions or feedback. But yeah, for now, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.